I'd like to see today's presentation as part of an ongoing dialogue about the considerations we're making around care. So I'm hoping that you'll not dash off. We can talk about some issues that are raised at the end, and I'm hoping that it will lead to more collaborative work about some of the considerations we're making. So without further ado, probably a good thing to do is introduce myself. I know some of you, but not everybody, and people know bits about me, but I suppose I would describe myself as a bit of a knowledge magpie. So I've got an undergraduate degree in sociology. I've spent many years teaching, including schools, colleges, and higher education. And more recently, I did my PhD using social psychology, which looked at language and discourse around gender, care, and a particular focus around parenting. And all of that has influenced the way I think about the things that I'm talking about today around care. But what I would say is one of the greatest influences on this has been the legacy of the students that I've taught along the way. And examples of that would be, more recently, one of my students that I taught in the 90s, some of you will know this, volunteered to be on a Channel 4 documentary called 15,000 Kids and Counting. And she was what I would describe, when I first started teaching, as one of the wild gang. She was one of the groups of students that I taught that the schools didn't want to teach. And Vicky came along to college and she told me she wanted to be a social worker, and she'd had experience in care herself, and she felt like nobody was really interested in her, and she really blossomed. And when she came to me recently and said, I've been approached by Channel 4, straight away I said, I'm not sure this is a good idea, Vicky. These smash and grab programs are, you know, they destroy people's lives. You could end up all over the red tops. And so she said, well, I think it's a good thing to do, Gemma. And she did it, and people, since she's been on TV, and she's now engaged in our ESRC events around social work and the media, and she talks about how people stop her in Asda and talk about, you know, how amazing she was as now she's a qualified social worker, and the things she talked about in the documentary. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the things I'm talking about today is influenced by that legacy, is influenced by the people that I've met along the way, influenced by the students that weren't necessarily the A-star students, but have making real difference in care practice as social workers, as nurses, and so on. So that's a bit about me. That's what I'm drawing on. The structure of the presentation is, first of all, I want us to think about the future of care, some of the contextual issues that are important to consider. I then want to explore philosophical ideas around care, and maybe trouble some of the ideas around voices of care and justice, and can they talk to each other, and what's the background around those. And then I want to move on and really sort of say, this is a great opportunity. We're all coming together in our busy lives to talk about issues around care. But how can we turn these discussions into something more practical? And so I'm using examples of activism, using social media, talking about how we need to put philosophical ideas into research methodology. And then I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about discourse, because that's really where my heart lies in terms of more recent research methodology, and why I think it's important that we think about the language around care and problematise normative practices around care. So that's the structure. Seems like I've got a lot to get through. So I'll crack on. And the first thing I want you to think about is this idea of the future of care. What will the future be? So it's about positioning ourselves in this really, in this question. What is the future of care? So, you know, we've had a substantial number of years where we've had marketisation of care in the UK. Managerialism is a dominant discourse within policies around care. on the policy horizon at the moment with the Care Act, and we're not sure how that's going to play out. And I'm learning as I go along with that new policy and the implications, but it's these ideas in the discourse of that policy around assessment, whether we're eligible, issues of criteria, and so on. So I think on that basis, our vision of care might be one of, oh no, they're still going down this line of marketisation. And what we know about the context is that we're living in an ageing population. We've got a declining fertility rate. And you know, for many people, that's wow, that's a lot to think about as it is. But we often forget that, you know, we're not the centre of the universe, the UK, and actually things are going on globally as well. And let's not forget HIV and AIDS and the epidemic in Africa. And that's just one example of why we need to think about care in a different way, and maybe how we use philosophy to understand that care is something that impacts us all and should be considered in a different way for the future. So on the basis of that, I suppose what I want to do is move on to talk about the philosophy of care. And for me, as I said, in my PhD, I was interested in care, why care is undervalued, why care is often invisible. And I was introduced to these ideas by reading a lot of second wave feminism, which saw care very much as gendered, together with these ideas of them being of it being undervalued. Now, with a feminist ethics of care, that was established through the work of Carol Gilligan, who challenged ideas about morality based on universalism. And she really looked at how morality, what is good and what is not, was based on ideas of universal rights, duties, and fairness. And Gilligan used Lawrence Kohlberg's research data to suggest that when we think about these universal rights and duties, what we're forgetting is that not everybody is starting at the same place. And she talked a lot about privileges in knowledge and how we needed to move away from the notion of justice as being this impartiality. We make impartial decisions about what's right and what's wrong. And Gilligan said, actually what we need to do is think about how care is something that we all need at some point in our life, across the life course, and that we can't make decisions about our own lives, particularly at points when we're vulnerable, without thinking about others. And so therefore, to think about what is morally right or good, we need to bear in mind that we're making those decisions when we based on our relationality with each other. So the philosophy of an ethics of care is the idea that care is something that we all need at some point in our lives. And Joan Tronto tried to push forward the work of Carol Gilligan by suggesting that we have phases of caring and that there is no getting away from the fact that we're all born a vulnerable infant. And so if we deny the fact that care is part of our lives, we're denying our own vulnerability when we were infants. And so the philosophy around feminist ethics of care was this idea that we cannot just think about the decisions we make about right and good and what's moral and just without realising that, you know, people are vulnerable, those decisions are shaped by those vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can happen or are possible at some point in our life or across the life course. So I suppose for me as a programme leader of social care, one of the things that I'm trying to unpick is what we mean by care, and so that when I'm speaking to students on the BA about social care, I'm trying to unpack some of these ideas about, you know, what does care mean to you? Do you see yourself as caring for? Do you see yourself as receiving care? Or have you done at some point? And I find it really difficult to teach the ideas about the philosophy of care, some of these ideas that I've just tried to explore, because they're a bit abstract. And difficult to sort of make the BA students understand them in terms of where they position themselves and these abstract philosophical ideas about care and what's morally right and morally just and so on. So for me, I think one of the ways that I try to get around that is by using case studies. And how many of you know about Justice for LB? Okay. So, why this case study? Well, one, because I feel quite strongly about it. And two, is because I think it is a concrete example of the importance of us not seeing care in a philosophical sense of vulnerability, of the need for us to recognise that we all have vulnerabilities at some point, or the need to understand that high quality care is important. And for me, it's about seeing that we all have a part to play in sending a message, using the language of care to improve people's lives. So let me say something about Justice for LB. So LB stands for Laughing Boy, and those of you that were at Rebecca's lecture last week will know that there's a huge Twitter campaign linked to Justice for LB, and I've chosen to talk about it today partly because I think we need to keep this chatter going around it. So Connor was 18, and in a recent radio interview that his mum gave, she talked about how Connor's behaviour, living at home, attending college, had got to a point where it was seen as more challenging. Connor had learning disabilities and also epilepsy, and there's, anybody knows that quite often there's a high diagnosis of those linked together. And in the radio interview she gave, she talked about this change of behaviour. And what struck me about this was that actually decisions were made about perhaps this behaviour. So decisions about him no longer being in college, decisions about him going into a secure unit, Southern Health secure unit in Oxford. But actually a lot of those behaviours were seen as quite normative behaviours that teenagers might have as they're going through all the sort of turmoils of a teenager's life. It's wanting to stay at home and watch DVDs rather than going to college. But unfortunately, because of his diagnosis, it led to a whole series of care decisions being made. And Connor was in this Slade house for 107 days, and then he was found drowned in the bath after having an epileptic seizure prior to drowning. Now, in that report, it was identified that his death was preventable, that the care did not meet his needs, and actually the staff, a new team was brought in to look at the care that was being provided to ensure it wouldn't happen again. And I would suggest one of the problems with that is bringing in a new team to sort that out doesn't deal with these philosophical issues we're talking about. Is what is care? What type of care are we providing? Why were those decisions made? What were the values involved leading to those decisions? And the campaign at the moment around Justice for LB is around challenging these types of decisions around care provision and saying we can't continue to let it happen. Now, this is not the only example, is it? We all know of lots of different examples, and Winterbourne is another example that people often use. But it comes down to the fact that these are not philosophical, discussions we can have, that it's much more, important than that, because we're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about ways of moving forward to improve care practice so that we can stop these things happening. So I'm going to move on now, but I'm going to come back to that campaign, and I'm going to move on to talk about the Twitter aspect of this, because it's really important, and this is something that I'm working on more and more, to use Twitter, and I try as much as I can to use Twitter and get my head around it. I don't use Facebook, and I suppose when we start having these conversations we can discuss why I don't use Facebook, but I don't use Facebook, but I do use Twitter, and I find Twitter is a great way of getting succinct messages across. And I love this idea that what Sarah Ahmed talks about under her Twitter name of Feminist Killjoy. She talks about the hardest work gives you indigestion, and it makes it, these things that we're trying to deal with, these philosophical debates we're having, in this case I'm talking about the ethic of care, it's not something we can just tick off our list. Yeah, we've discussed that. Yeah, we can make that change and everything will be fine. Well, we know that's not the case. We've got to keep discussing where we want to be revisioning our future and where care is situated in our lives, both at policy level and in terms of us as individuals and the way we talk about it, and institutions, and obviously care practice. So why this? Well, as somebody who likes to do discourse analysis, what's interesting is the way that the Justice for LB campaign talks about the importance of having a talk. So me stood here saying all these words, you'd like to think a few of them will sink in and you'll think, yeah, I agree with her on that, I'm not sure about what she means on that, and so on. But it's about engaging in dialogue and talking and trying to see different people's point of views on care and what's going on, not just in terms of Justice for LB, but in terms of sort of care practice and vulnerability in society. But it's not talk alone, is it? It's about action as well, and it's about activism. And I find Twitter and this part of this Twitter group around Justice for LB is a great example that I use with my social care students to say, actually, you can actively engage in this. Those of you that lack confidence, that wouldn't want to do a talk, who feel uncomfortable about expressing how you feel about particular incidents in care and so on, you can use Twitter. It can be succinct, it can, you can get your point across, and it can make a difference because people will retweet you, people will follow you. It's about getting a message out there. And then we can sort of look at what is that message and what do we really mean and do we agree with it and so on. So for me, this sums up, this idea, but it's not just about talk. And a slide that I've got later on looks at a quilt, and that's what the bottom bit here is. How people were asked to make a little patch to join a quilt up about how they felt about Justice for LB, about Connor, and there was that, well, you'll see it, there's, stitched Eddie Stobart vehicles, and there's all sorts of stuff on there. But again, if you look at the WordPress around that, it's this idea that people can express how they feel about care in a practical way that is important because they spoke to each other about their patches on the quilt. They met together. They now know each other. They're now going to do other things together. So it's not just about sending a tweet. There's lots of other ways in which we can join up in terms of activism and make changes to what we don't like about care. So now I want to talk a little bit about discourse and care. For me, I think it's really important that we don't move away from what George Julian's saying about talk, and that we need to see how we can use talk to challenge things, make changes, and so on. And I must admit that this is something that I'm still working on, how I use language to influence, to persuade, to get you lot to listen to me. It doesn't come easily. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to stop trying to convince you about why I think care is important and the value of care and the ethics of care. So I'm just going to talk through a few things on this slide because I think they're important. So the idea around discourse and care is that the words we use to describe our experiences play a part in the construction of the meanings that we attribute to such experiences. So for me, when I'm teaching and I talk to the students about the language that they use, whether we're using a case study or what, something that's happened to them, I often remind them that actually, why did you say it in that way? Let's try and think about talking about it in a different way. And they say, well, I'm not sure, that's how I always talk about it. Yeah, but that's the problem. That's how we need to make changes. And language gives us the tool to maybe make different experiences or use alternative ways of reality, of trying out different things. And it does take confidence. But that, as I say, that's not a reason to stop doing it. So Gergen and Gergen link this to social constructionist theory, and they say, look, we need to get away from formulaic ways of talking about things such as care, or of challenging privileged knowledge, and actually think creatively how we can look at methodologies that have traditionally been established in different disciplines, how we can be more interdisciplinary in our use of language to challenge maybe poor examples of care. And as a result of that, Gergen and Gergen argue, it will produce new knowledge, moves away from normatives understanding of the way care is and the way care should be. So hopefully through chipping away and changing the way we describe things, such as care, we can then revision the future of care practice and how we all position ourselves as citizens in providing care. So for me and my PhD, what I did was I used what was known as discourse resources and discourse practices. And it took me a long time to get my head around what those things were. And I went to conferences, 2008, I went to a conference, and as soon as I said the word discourse analysis, everybody went, oh, and I sort of literally heard the chairs go like that as if people were walking out. I didn't know this was about discourse analysis. I'm not really interested in that methodology. And so part of my aim these days is try and convince people that actually there is mileage in sticking with it and having a go with it. And discourse analysis is being used more and more by people interested in care and the ethics of care because it's seen as a way of linking methodologies around ethnography and observation, and so that when the ethnography so an example, I suppose, is the best way to explain this point. Frans Vos, professor situated in the Netherlands, did lots of ethnographic research and observations of doctors in hospital settings. And he knew what he wanted to say, and he wanted to say that actually doctors are going through procedures. When they're doing a lumbar puncture, they're going through the procedure that they've been taught, but actually there's something missing. So what he started doing was He was more interested in the language that the doctors used when they performed the lumbar puncture. And so he used the methodology of both ethnography and discourse analysis and brought them together to suggest actually if doctors thought better about the way they described what a lumbar puncture was or what the procedure was going to take place, that actually the patient would feel a little bit calmer, although they would know what was about to happen, that was going to be extremely painful, but they actually felt that there was some care being provided whilst the lumbar puncture was being done by the doctor. So this idea of discourse resources and discourse practices, the resources are the things that we use in terms of the normative language, the ways that we talk about things. And for me in my PhD, my focus was on what are the issues around the normal way we talk about caring done by parents. And then, once we've got the ideas about what the way we talk about it on a general level and the way that policies like work and family research policy, work and family policies around parenting and working parenting, I was interested in the critical discourse analysis of, what were they saying? What were the expectations generally, the normative practice that working parents should be doing? So I was looking at objects, subjects, versions of reality available to people. And then on a micro level, what I was really interested with, when I interviewed parents, were they situating themselves in that normative practice, that normative discourse, or were they challenging it? What were they saying that made me think, oh, they were actually challenging it or positioning themselves in the discourse, these versions of social reality where we're all supposed to be working, caring, and so on. I suppose another way to understand it is to think about the fact that when we speak and when we look at policy, we're supposed to follow scripts based on normative practices of the types of carers we're supposed to be. So a lot of research that I looked at for my PhD was around fathering, mothering, intensive mothering, this idea that you have to be sacrifice the self and meet the child's needs at all time. And Seven Hewson, who's really prolific in writing about the ethic of care, suggests that this is one of the problems. People feel that they have to follow a script when they talk about being a mother, or follow a script when they talk about being a father, being a carer, because they're worried about how people will react if they say, I can't bear to listen to my baby crying. It's the last thing I want to do. I want to be at work. I really don't want to care for this child. Yeah. But to understand how discourse can shape or change the way we think about care and care practices, there's lots of research being done about the way that we can once we give the understanding of how language can shape and change and revision the future, then we're passing on tools that can help people to have agency in that. So an example is that there was a lot of work done in Dutch schools around bullying. And what the researchers looked at was that when they interviewed young people in schools and said, can you talk to us about bullying? Well, it didn't really happen. People were not forthcoming. So what instead they did is, okay, if this happened, what would you do? If you felt that this occurred, so the researchers created like scenarios of bullying. If this happened, what would you do? Oh, we'd just laugh. So one of the ways in which they used discourse analysis was to say to them, actually, when you do that, this is the outcome of that interaction. So if you continue to laugh when you think somebody's being bullied and you're observing it, then it will reinforce that as normative and it will carry on and it will happen again. So what the researchers tried to do was develop a series of school plays. And what they did in these plays was they tried to sort of give both outcomes. So in the play, they did the bullying scenario and the normative practice of how these young people are reacting in a bullying situation. And then they did the alternative version, the revisioned version of if we did it this way, this is what happens. So the plays were really a way of giving tools to these young people about how you could do it differently, so that people could see the tools and they could be more confident to try them out in school. Another example of the way that discourse analysis and looking at the way we use language in our everyday talk is the research being done by De Kock around sexual health promotion. And this is another example of considering people's talk about normative practice. And in this instance in Malawi, it was around infertility. So the researchers looked at how it interviewed lots of couples who had issues of infertility. And quite often what they were finding in this everyday talk, there were lots of examples of cultural normative response to finding out your partner, your wife is infertile, is, oh, and you know, in our culture, men have to become fathers. It's part of my masculinity. So I decided I'd marry somebody else after that. And these examples kept recurring in the interview data. And what they decided to do was, because they were so concerned, the researchers, about sexual health and sexually transmitted diseases, they set up a sexual health promotion campaign around, right, okay, let's try and unpick why you think that it's okay to then go and sleep with 3 other women before you decide what you're going to do about the fact that you think your wife might be infertile. Now, I sort of made that oversimplistic, but it's this idea that once these people knew or had it identified that, you know, this is the way you're talking about it, and don't you think you should think differently about, you know, the way you're talking about it, and why you think it's normal that you know that your answer to any infertility within your partnership is to go elsewhere and have sex with, you know, other partners. So I'd like to argue here that through my investment in discourse analysis and the way that language can enlighten us to the way that we talk about things, and I suppose it's a bit like if I was to listen to this presentation afterwards, I would think, oh, I would maybe say that differently, or I'd use that different example. It's about sort of having an awareness that actually, yeah, we've done it this way, we've spoken about it this way, because that's the sort of script that I normally use when I'm doing this type of seminar. And instead thinking, actually, you know, that is normative, but that doesn't mean it has to go on. I need to keep doing it that way. And that, you know, I find that the potentialities of that in terms of discourse as a methodology really helpful. And so going back to the points that I made earlier around philosophy of care and the way we think about care, for me, I find that I like the literature. I'm really interested in what these philosophers have to say, but quite often that's not enough for me. I feel frustrated that, yeah, all right, so you can tell me that caring is this, and I've been a vulnerable infant, and that, you know, we all need to care for each other, and care should be seen across the life course, otherwise, you know, we're not in a sustainable society. Yeah, I know all of that, and thanks, I've read all that now, but how can I make it meaningful? How can I, as a researcher, make sense of those things and make changes to care practice and challenge things that I'm not happy about in terms of what's happening in care, and how can I help others to do that? So, social care, I'm very invested in that. As programme leader of the BA Social Care, I think it's really important that we use that as an exemplar. I'm fully aware that at Burley we are interdisciplinary, and I'm hoping that there are not just people sat in the audience just from social care and social work, because I think we need to do more interdisciplinary work. But I am using social care as an exemplar because I think it's really important that we see that, you know, 1.5 million are employed in the social care sector. That's 6% of the UK's labour force, rising to, this is estimated, rising to 2.5 million by 2025, and it contributes to 43 billion of the economy. So what? Well, I suppose if I was, you know, in one sense, I could just say, well, yeah, so it's a socioeconomic problem. But because of what I've already said in this seminar, what I'm suggesting is it's not just about that. That is really reductionist if we think about it in that sense. And an example of that for me is the fact that more recently a student's come to see me about what do I do to get a job working in social care, Gemma, and I've got all this voluntary work. And we started talking about this and I'm saying, yeah, there's loads of potential for the future. It's a growing area. And then I started thinking, actually, maybe I need to talk to this person about what they see as care and where they see, you know, where they see their future and what they think they'll be doing when they work in the social care sector. And during these conversations with this student, she said to me, I'm a volunteer at the moment with people with dementia. I'm not enjoying it. So I said, why not? She went, well, the thing is, she said, I'm a volunteer and I'm seeing loads of the staff doing things that I don't like. Right, okay. So it's sort of putting me off going into social care. I was like, right, okay, so what are you doing about it? Well, nothing really. I just don't feel confident enough to challenge it. So what I did, drawing on the ideas that I have about language and how we can shape things, I was saying, right, okay, well, maybe if you try and speak to this person in this way, it might help. Or maybe do you feel confident about, oh, I don't know, I couldn't talk to anybody about it. Okay, well, what about if we think about formulating a script? Oh, yeah, I quite like that idea. So for me, it's this idea that I feel that when students come to me and they talk about working in social care, it's not just talking about, you know, the context and a socioeconomic level, but it's talking about what is care to you, why would you want to be in care, you know, and all the things that are happening in social care. Would you have the skills to maybe challenge things that you see as, you know, you're not happy with in terms of care? Policy, practice, research, social media and activism are not separate. They all use language, they all send out messages. We can use them to revision the future of care. And we need to do this not just through talk, but through action, activism, collectivism, working together. And this was the example that I gave earlier about the quilt. 3 months, a very large quilt or blanket, and it tells a story, but it doesn't just tell a story about LB, it tells a story about people actually giving a toss, which goes back to the title of this seminar, Who Cares? People do care. You know, everybody who's sat in this room are here because actually they realise that it's important and we need to think about the care in terms of the future as practitioners, as researchers, as scholars, and related to ourselves and our, you know, on a familial and a societal level in terms of care. So if you don't do anything else, I'd like to make sure that you tweet or Twitter or send this message out about Justice for LB, because I think it's really important, and we do want to keep the buzz going around it. There is a bill. We are asking for pledges. When I say we, I'm saying that as a member of the collective. I'm not any powerful, significant member of this at all. You know, Rebecca Lawtham, I spoke to Rebecca Lawtham about this, and she was so excited that we're using Justice for LB as a way of saying, you know, like we need to work together as a collective to have days of action in all different type of ways. So please tweet, do what you can, send out the message. If you've got any links in terms of media or MPs, or you feel like you could send the message out wider, please do so. There is a bill, so they are trying to engage policymakers to make changes through the way that we frame and use wider discourse when we're looking at caring for people with learning disabilities. So that's this idea about discourse resources, normative practice about people with learning disabilities needs to change, and through things like bills and changes to legislation and engaging with policymakers, we can influence or try to influence higher levels of discourse at the same time on a level of practitioner, scholar, activist, however you might describe yourself. It's about the language we use, the fact that we're passing this message on, and having probably a wider debate about the value of care and the ethics of care and so on. So please pass this message on, it's really important. And it's not just this message, it's about care more generally. So what have I tried to do in this really condensed space? Well, I've tried to talk a little bit about context of care. You know, we shouldn't be so blinkered and think, you know, it's just about the individual, it's about what I do in terms of looking after my family. It's about so much more than that. I'd like to suggest that definitions of care are diffuse and vague. It's, you know, and I put Joan Tronto's slide up there to show that actually there are loads of different ways we can interpret what we mean by care, but we need to continue to look at those things, you know, and challenge them and think about them and get students, if we're teachers, to think about what we mean by care as practitioners. What am I doing now? Is this care? Is it of the standard that it should be, and so on? We need to think beyond care as being about a socio-economic problem, about marketisation, managerialism. I'm not suggesting those things are not important to discuss, but I'm saying that they should be situated within a greater discussion about values of care and ethics of care. So, you know, that's the point I'm trying to make there. This idea that care is both universal, we are, you know, vulnerable throughout the life course, and we need to remember that, you know. But that often care has particularities as well. So it's not the fact that we can just sort of say everybody's care is the same. We all know it's not. You know, so this idea that care is both universal and particular, and you know, it's the pressing issue of sustainability. So that's my take-home message. I hope you found that helpful. I do want to discuss it in more detail. This is me trying out some ideas. This is not about me saying I know it all, definitely not. This is about me trying ideas out to take it forward, I think, in terms of where we go about thinking about care and these issues that I've discussed. So, yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you all for sitting through that.